The battlefield stretched endlessly, a sea of chaos and destruction. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. On one side, 70,000 men, a formidable force of seasoned warriors, stood ready. On the other, 30,000 men, outnumbered but resolute, prepared for the inevitable clash. The sun rose, casting a grim light on the faces of the soldiers. Among the smaller force was Captain Eric, a man whose determination was as unyielding as the steel of his sword. He knew the odds were against them, but retreat was not an option. The first wave of the enemy charged, a thunderous roar accompanying their advance. Eric's men held their ground, their hearts pounding in unison with the beat of war drums. The clash was deafening, swords clanging, and cries of pain filling the air. Eric fought with a ferocity born of necessity, every strike a testament to his will to survive. Despite their bravery, the smaller force began to falter. The sheer number of enemies was overwhelming. Eric rallied his men, urging them to hold the line. "For our homes, for our families," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Hours passed like minutes, and the battlefield became a graveyard. Bodies lay strewn across the ground, the once green field now a muddy red. Eric's forces were dwindling, but their spirit remained unbroken. They fought not just for victory, but for honor, in the hope that their sacrifice would not be in vain. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the carnage, the battle reached its zenith. Eric, bloodied and exhausted, found himself face to face with the enemy's general. The two men locked eyes, understanding that this duel could decide the fate of thousands. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Eric struck down his opponent. The enemy, witnessing their leader's fall, began to waver. Seizing the moment, Eric's men pushed forward with renewed vigor, driving the larger force into retreat. The battle was won, but at a tremendous cost. Eric stood amidst the fallen, his heart heavy with the weight of their sacrifice. Victory had come, but it was bittersweet. The price of war was etched into the land and the souls of those who survived. In the end, it was not just a battle of numbers, but of wills. The 30,000 men had defied the odds, proving that courage and determination could triumph, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The sun rose over the dusty plains, illuminating two vast armies facing each other across a wide valley. On one side, 81,000 soldiers stood in formation, their armor glinting in the early morning light. Across from them, a smaller force of 40,800 men prepared for battle, determination etched on their faces. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, General Marcus surveyed the opposing army from atop his horse. Though his forces were larger, he knew victory was far from assured. The enemy was well positioned on higher ground, and their reputation for tactical brilliance was well earned. As trumpets blared, signaling the start of the engagement, Marcus raised his sword and shouted to his troops, "Forward, men, for honor and glory!" With a thunderous roar, the larger army surged across the valley. Arrows darkened the sky as archers on both sides unleashed volley after volley. The clash of steel rang out as the front lines met in a frenzy of swords and spears. Hour after hour, the battle raged. Though outnumbered, the smaller force held their ground tenaciously. Their general, a wily veteran named Cassius, utilized the terrain masterfully to negate the enemy's numerical advantage. As the sun began to set, both armies were battered and bloody. Thousands lay dead or wounded across the battlefield. Neither side had gained a decisive advantage. In the growing darkness, the two generals met under a flag of truce. After conferring briefly, they agreed to withdraw their forces and seek terms for peace. The war that had seemed inevitable that morning ended not with a glorious victory, but with a hard-fought stalemate, a reminder that in war, numbers alone do not determine the outcome. In the misty dawn of a crisp autumn morning, two armies faced each other across a vast, open plain. To the north stood the Crimson Legion, 16,000 strong, their red banners fluttering in the cool breeze. Opposing them from the south was the Azure Alliance, numbering 14,000, their blue standards held high with pride. General Darius of the Crimson Legion surveyed the battlefield from atop his white stallion. He knew his force had the numerical advantage, but the Azure Alliance was known for its superior cavalry and cunning tactics. Darius had positioned his archers on the flanks, with his heavy infantry forming an impenetrable wall at the center. Across the field, Commander Elena of the Azure Alliance studied her opponent's formation. Though outnumbered, she had a plan. Her elite cavalry units were hidden in the nearby forests, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Her infantry, smaller in number but better trained, stood ready to meet the Crimson Legion head-on. As the sun rose higher, trumpets blared from both sides. The earth trembled as thousands of men began to march. Arrows darkened the sky as the initial volleys were launched. The clash of steel and the cries of warriors filled the air. As the two armies collided at the center of the plain, for hours, the battle raged, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. Just as the Crimson Legion seemed to be pushing the Azure Alliance back, Commander Elena sprung her trap. From the forests emerged her cavalry, charging into the exposed flanks of the Crimson Legion. The sudden assault threw Darius's forces into disarray. As the sun began to set, the dust settled on the battlefield. Despite their numerical disadvantage, the Azure Alliance had emerged victorious through superior strategy and the element of surprise. The Crimson Legion retreated, leaving behind their dreams of conquest. In the annals of history, the Battle of Twin Peaks would be remembered not for the number of soldiers involved, but for the brilliant tactics that proved that victory is not always determined by the size of one's army, but by the strength of one's strategy and the courage of one's convictions.